This is Dustin Hurst, staff writer for Watchdog.org, Washington State. I'm here with Maxford Nelson, the senior labor analyst with the Olympia-based Freedom Foundation. We're going to talk about Washington and the Seattle area as a starting point or a jumping off point for progressive and socialist policies. Max, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our readers who may not be familiar with the work that you do and the work that the Freedom Foundation does.
Sure. Well, thanks, Dustin. And I might add right off the bat, I'm not only the senior labor analyst at the Freedom Foundation, I'm also the only labor analyst at the Freedom Foundation. So
therefore, you are the senior labor analyst.
Yes, indeed, makes it that much easier, right? But yeah, no, Freedom Foundation we're a nonprofit think tank and advocacy group. As you mentioned, we're based down in Olympia, Washington. We have a mission to pursue individual liberty and promote free enterprise and limited accountable government in Washington State. So we are primarily focused on state and local policy issues in Washington, and a big area of emphasis for us at the moment, as of the last 6 months or so, has been labor policy issues, particularly related to union reform and increasing the freedom of individual workers and giving them more control, or seeking to give them more control over their union representation and whether or not they want to be part of a union in Washington. So that's really briefly kind of an encapsulation of what we do and the type of issues that we work on. We do, like I said, do a lot of work with local grassroots activists. So we're a little different than a normal policy think tank in that respect, and we also engage in litigation, public interest litigation, and that's also something that sets us apart a little from a number of think tank groups out there. So, right. And of course, there's been so much happening in Seattle and the Puget Sound area over the last year in regard to minimum wage and paid sick leave and other employment standards regulation, that's been something that I've been spending a lot of my time on, again, for about the last year.
So, break it down for me, Max. What is going on in Seattle? It seems like it's always in the news, or at least up until about 2 weeks ago when the Seattle City Council voted on the new wage law, that it was always in the news. Tell me what's going on there, man. It seems crazy.
Well, it is hard, even for me, and I eat and sleep this stuff, to keep up with all the details. But basically, for a period of since the beginning of the year, the Mayor of Seattle, Mayor Murray, had commissioned an income inequality advisory committee composed of some business groups and labor groups, some nonprofit labor groups, to basically commission them to come up with some minimum wage plan that would eventually, in some way, get the city to a $15 an hour minimum wage. And they ended up coming out with a very complicated proposal that is phased in over a period of several years. It has different rates of increase in the minimum wage for different sized employers. Different types of employers are allowed to count, tips toward the $15 an hour total, but only for a certain time. Eventually, that credit for tips gets phased out. Other employers can count health care benefits, again, for a certain amount of time only, and then those are phased out. So it was a very complicated plan. Ultimately, it was basically approved by the City Council in the same form that it came out of the Mayor's Advisory Committee, and that's what got all the news coverage a couple weeks ago, was the official adoption in Seattle of that plan. And so the questions now are all focused on what happens next. The ordinance itself begins to take effect on April 1st of 2015, so we're still a little ways out from anybody actually having to comply with the ordinance or any workers receiving increases in their pay. That first bump in the minimum wage doesn't happen until April. But we have elections in November between now and then, and there have been various efforts that have been rumored and talked about to put various other minimum wage related measures on the ballot in Seattle this fall. And so that's kind of where things are centered around now. I'll keep going if you like, but do feel free to interject if you've got something you want me to stop on. But part of the reason.
Let's look at how you said that the law doesn't take effect for about a year.
Mhm.
Are businesses, are they starting to make plans to deal with the law? Because obviously they're going to have to make some large changes in how they conduct their operations.
Right.
Have you guys seen businesses either starting to move out of Seattle or make plans to move out of Seattle or cut workers? Maybe magically somehow they'll increase workers. I mean, what? That's how economics works. Right? Anyway, we'll talk about that later.
Right.
But what are businesses doing to deal with this new law?
Well, so far, I mean, any evidence coming out of Seattle is anecdotal. But yes, businesses are certainly talking about and thinking about how they're going to respond to this new law. And they were doing that before it was even official. I mean, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion. At least, for most folks who were following this by the beginning of the year, it was pretty clear Seattle's going to end up with some fairly hefty minimum wage increase. And so even in the process of the mayor's committee negotiations, conversations that I had with various business owners were, these folks were very concerned, already assuming it was going to happen, and basically saying we're probably going to move our operations outside Seattle. There are other factors at work, of course, but this is kind of just the last straw for us, and so we're just going to move out. I know it was recently announced again right after the city council acted and made the minimum wage plan official, that CenturyLink was going to be moving 100 some odd jobs out of the Seattle area, just handling phone calls and that kind of thing. No explicit link necessarily to the minimum wage increase, but it could have had something to do with it, certainly. So it's been a mix. I mean, I'm absolutely sure there's business owners out there who are now trying to sit down and crunch the numbers and figure out what they need to do to stay afloat. Maybe that means moving outside Seattle. Maybe that means cutting back on hiring. It's very early to say, but we'll be seeing, I'm sure, a lot of stories in the coming months and years about how various folks are reacting to this new ordinance.
Now, the city of SeaTac, which is a suburb of Seattle, adopted a similar proposal. It was right away, this happens by initiative. I think it was implemented, if I'm not mistaken, it was January 1st. It was $15 an hour right away. Businesses didn't have time to adjust. And of course, SeaTac is a small suburb of Seattle, but there are businesses there that had to cope with it. Are you guys seeing any effects of that new labor law in SeaTac?
Yes, and again, most of the evidence has been anecdotal. Couple things to know about SeaTac's initiative. As you mentioned, it did go straight to $15 an hour on January 1st of this year. There was no phase in time. However, it wasn't a across-the-board minimum wage increase like Seattle's just adopted. The initiative in SeaTac targeted specifically, hotels, large hotels, transportation-related employers in SeaTac that cater to the airport, essentially. A number of airport jobs and employers were also initially covered by the initiative. There's ongoing litigation about whether or not the initiative, a city initiative, is binding on the airport, which is actually controlled by the Port of Seattle. So there's some jurisdictional battles being played out in the courts right now, which means practically that none of the businesses on the airport, and that's where most of the jobs are located, none of the businesses at the airport have yet to deal with this requirement. So there's only a handful of businesses off airport property that have had to comply. Now, one of these is a parking business, and they've responded. They had to provide $15 an hour to all their employees. They've responded by tacking on a living wage surcharge, they call it, to their bills for folks who go use their parking services. And so if you go to the master park, you stay there for a day and you get your receipt, you'll see a line item on there, living wage surcharge,
right,
X amount. But we've also heard from, I believe it was a Northwest Asian Weekly reported on a story that got picked up by a number of news outlets. One of the folks at that publication had talked to several employees at one of the hotels in SeaTac that was covered by the ordinance. And they were just asking the employees how they felt about the minimum wage increase, and their response was essentially, it sounded like a good idea at the time. Of course we would want to be paid more, but apparently they no longer get a list of benefits that they used to get. No 401k, have to pay for their own parking. There's no free meals, a list of other things. And so they were, at best ambivalent, and at worst saying, that hey, this really hasn't turned out nearly as good as we thought it was going to.
So the question is when do the labor unions who back the initiative plan a new initiative to guarantee 401ks and free meals and free parking? When are we going to see that?
Well, see, that's gets to a more fundamental question, right? I mean, you can regulate, but the government can come in and regulate wages, as they've done in this case, and it's going to produce certain unintended consequences. And if you want to try to go fix those consequences, fix, quote unquote, meaning government barring employers from eliminating the means by which they offset the cost of this other government mandate, you're going to just make the consequences that much stiffer on businesses. It gets to the point of absurdity fairly quick. I mean, what are you going to say to a business? You have to pay your employees $15 an hour, provide all these gold-plated benefits, and you have to remain profitable, because if you go out of business, those people would lose their jobs, and we can't have that. So it gets down to the basic point that you can't mandate profitability. You just can't get around that unless you try to overhaul the entire system, which I know is what our lovely socialist city councilwoman gets to frequently. If you press her hard enough on the evidence about the negative consequences of the minimum wage, she'll just shoot back with, well, if our system can't support paying all workers a living wage, then maybe this isn't the kind of system that we want. And of course, her solution is blow the entire thing up and start over with pure socialism. So it's a road that I would argue you don't really want to travel down too far.
Yeah, well, we're going down that road whether we like it or not. At least in the Seattle area, and maybe in some suburbs and other cities
Right.
going forward. I know San Diego's looking at a law to raise their minimum wage. So this is definitely started a trend. But let's get back to Seattle. You said that the law that they passed was very complicated and kind of onerous for some businesses, perhaps. What are one or two of the biggest problems you see with the law as the city council passed it?
Well, I think just the size of the increase itself is going to be the biggest issue, and I actually have mixed feelings about the process by which the measure was developed, because it was very much, and there are indications that business was pressured far more strongly in those negotiations to make concessions than labor was. But it was a compromise process between business and labor, and I think that's part of the reason why you saw such a complicated plan emerge from those negotiations. And it's not an understatement to say, and I've emphasized this since they passed it, that this is the most complicated wage regulation scheme in the country. I would venture to say at this time, and the benefit to that, on the one hand, is that it's not a flat $15 an hour increase for everybody overnight, because in practical terms that would have much more immediate negative consequences than if you phase this thing in over time and target it to all these different employers. But the other part of me recognizes that because it's more complicated, it's also more regulation, right? And it's harder to enforce, and it results in more government intervention into the marketplace, and it's not uniform. If you're going to have government intervention in the market, I would argue you create a system in which everybody plays by the same rules, and that's not really what you see coming out of this, out of the council's ordinance. And then again, you just get back to the economics of the whole thing. It's a bad plan one way or another. Increasing the minimum wage this drastically is going to have negative consequences. I would almost rather, I would almost rather they pass a straight $15 minimum wage for everybody, no exemptions, make it easy to enforce, and then just watch the economy burn down, as opposed to dragging it out over 5-7 years. So, I like I said, I can go kind of back and forth on that point. In the end, it's just a bad policy. There's not a good way to get around that.
Now, I know that the driving force behind this was Kashana Sawant. The mayor had talked about increasing the minimum wage, but I think Kashama was the big driving force. She's the socialist city council member that you mentioned. I know that she had talked about taking an initiative process before the voters, or trying to gather signatures for an initiative if the wage was not passed fast enough. Is she still talking about doing an initiative?
Well, and that's a great point. And hold on one second, Dustin. I need to plug in before my battery dies.
That's all right.
All right, sorry about that. No, that's a great question. And initially 15 Now and so on's socialist alternative party backers were gathering signatures for a charter amendment, which would have created their own minimum wage plan and written it right into the city charter. So actually, it would have overridden whatever ordinance the city council had passed.
Right.
And so their plan would have been $15 an hour minimum wage for everybody. Well, for businesses with more than 250 employees on January 1, 2015. Businesses with less than 250 employees would have 3 years to phase into the 15 total. Much simpler than the mayor's plan, but again, consequences would be more concentrated. So that was hanging in the background throughout the mayor's advisory committee's deliberations and throughout the city council's deliberations. And conveniently, about a week after, or even just a few days after the council passed their ordinance, the city attorney came out with an opinion that basically informed everybody that charter amendments can't actually be run in even-numbered years. They have to be run in odd-numbered years. So the earliest that 15 Now could actually get their charter amendment on the ballot would be fall of 2015.
Wow.
And so that had a number of folks in the business community upset because they were operating under the assumption that if we don't act now, this thing's going to be facing us on the ballot in just a few months. Now, I haven't heard anything officially from 15 Now, one way or another, about whether or not they want to pursue that long term. I doubt it, though. They've been so positive in the spin that they've put on the new city's ordinance or the new city ordinance that I think they've kind of lost all credibility for calling for something more at this point.
Right.
The indications are, and the rumors have been, that they're just going to focus on turning their time and energy to other cities now, and probably won't consider pursuing something harsher in Seattle.
Now, I know that because this is a Seattle thing, it only applies to Seattle. Is 15 Now going to pursue other cities, maybe Spokane, maybe Tacoma, any other cities in Washington, or are they going to go on to San Diego, Portland? What's their plan next? Do you happen to know that?
Well, I know they do want to take the movement national as much as possible, and they've claimed chapters in a dozen or so cities nationwide. I don't know how active those chapters are. My gut feeling is that most of the minimum wage activism we're seeing in other states is coming from labor organized groups, labor unions primarily, which have been behind the fast food protests and so forth that have been going on for the last year. I think most of 15 Now's strength really is here in Washington State. And so as far as 15 Now backing further minimum wage increases, I think Washington's probably the best area for them to pursue that. And they have talked about and been reported as wanting to run an initiative, a $15 an hour initiative in Tacoma as early as next fall. Rumors have swirled around about Spokane, Bellevue, and some other cities, Burien. The head of the Spokane City Council recently came out, though, and said that increasing or creating their own citywide minimum wage in Spokane was not on their agenda. But, a year and a few months ago, increasing the minimum wage in Seattle wasn't on anybody's agenda either. So it's really too early to say with certainty where and how this is going to play out, but the indications are that they do want to take this to as many cities as possible. So it's going to continue to be an issue both here in Washington and nationally.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you to stick your neck out a little bit. this is after the celebration, when they passed the law, the wage law, they were all out there eating cake, tweeting pictures and Instagramming pictures of the cake that they were eating, calling this a historic day for Seattle. Take us 10, 20 years in the future. How is future or how are future people going to remember the Seattle City Council when they look back upon this historic day?
Well, if you look back to FDR's actions, creating the minimum wage to begin with, you can ask anybody how they view, the legacy of the minimum wage that he first created with his New Deal policies, and you're going to get two different responses based on who you're talking to. Those who are more free market oriented are going to see the consequences of that action and of the increases in the minimum wage since then, and call it a failed policy. But those who are ideologically sold out to this idea of government intervention in the economy and ultimately socialist takeover of the economy, I don't think you're ever going to be able to convince those folks that the consequences are the fault of their policy ideas. So with that said, on the actual ramifications that I think Seattle is going to experience over the next few years, it is going to be a gradual phase in, and so we are going to see gradual consequences. But because the minimum wage in Seattle is going to be indexed to inflation and increase automatically each year, I do think you're not going to have a situation where you drastically increase the minimum wage and then its value is gradually eroded over time by inflation, which would ease the consequences. You are going to have a situation where the minimum wage is raised a level, it stays with inflation, then it gets raised again and again and again. And so those consequences are going to keep being phased in as well. So 10 years from now, I would be surprised if prices hadn't risen significantly in Seattle. I would be surprised if teen unemployment hadn't skyrocketed, that minorities were having a hard time finding jobs, that you had employers, moving outside city limits, provided there are still cities nearby to Seattle that don't have such a requirement. I don't think you're going to see any noticeable reduction in poverty. And I think we're probably going to be having a very similar conversation all over again because the problems that the minimum wage is meant to address, low-income work, educated or boosting the status in society of low-skilled and less educated workers, those goals are not going to have been fulfilled. And a great example is Washington State's currently very high minimum wage that was implemented by initiative back in 1998. Some of the rhetoric that was going on at the time back in the 90s was very similar to the rhetoric that we have coming out of Seattle right now with this $15 minimum wage. And we have seen Washington State's minimum wage increase dramatically over the last few years. But there has been absolutely no decline in the number of folks in poverty. It hasn't destroyed the state's economy, no, but it has had very little benefit, no measurable benefit. And in the same time, you've seen the teen unemployment rate skyrocket to nationwide highs. And like I said, here we are again 10, 12 years down the road after we passed a statewide initiative that was supposed to solve our problems for all time, having the same conversation. So I would be surprised if we weren't in this exact same place 10 years from now.
Okay. We got to wrap it up, but I got one more question for you. You guys are free market folks. What name two things that the city council could have done or could do right away to improve the Seattle economy instead of raising the minimum wage? What would you like to see them do to lift people out of poverty and to increase jobs in the area?
Well, Seattle's known for progressive employment policies, and they've enacted several over the last year. Minimum wage was just the latest and the most stringent. Back last spring, the city council passed an ordinance basically banning employers from asking about the criminal backgrounds of their employees. And I think the research on that issue has shown that just makes employers less likely to go out on a limb and hire folks, maybe minorities that they could perceive as having a greater likelihood of having a criminal background. Similarly, the city council passed a mandatory paid sick leave ordinance back in 2012, and we've seen, again, the research on that has shown that it's produced very little benefit, but it has resulted in increased prices, decreased benefits for workers, and decreases in their compensation. And so I think continuing to make Seattle a less friendly city in terms of actually, incentivizing employers to go hire people is totally going in the wrong direction. And it's one of those issues where you really are diametrically opposed here. I would argue Seattle goes and repeals those employment standards regulations because they're disincentivizing employers from hiring workers. And the socialists on the other side would say, no, we need to keep adding these various layers and layers. So again, we're totally divergent on the direction to go. But those are two things. Make it easier to hire folks by getting rid of these paid sick leave ordinance and the ban on the criminal background checks for employers.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you, Max, for joining us today, and hopefully we'll talk to you again next week.
My pleasure. Thanks, Dustin.
Thanks, man.